Behoba. Red. Welcome to Baobab, Redwood, and Neem, an interview series by Peace Vigil, which seeks to inspire actions to protect and promote peace. Today we'll be talking to award-winning documentary filmmaker Anand Patwardhan. If you enjoy these podcasts, please do leave a comment wherever you're listening. With that, please enjoy this interview with Anand Patwardhan. Welcome to today's Baobab, Redwood, and Neem. Our guest today is the celebrated documentary filmmaker Anand Patwardhan. Mr. Patwardhan has been making films since the 1970s, among them Ram Ke Naam and Bhim Comrade. His most recent film is Reason, which focuses on the lives and teachings of 4 activists who were recently murdered. His awards and accomplishments are far too long to list, but Reason has won several prizes, including the prize for Best Documentary at the IDFA Film Festival in Amsterdam. Mr. Patwardhan, it's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, nice to be here.
Going back, sir, your first film was released way back in 1971 on repression in Bihar.
Don't call me sir, because I haven't been knighted, and if I had been, I would have returned it.
Correct. Anandji, your first film was way back in 1971 on repression in India, in Bihar. And it would be fair to say that not many people were making movies on these kind of issues at that time. So what inspired you to make that kind of, or to become a filmmaker and to make those kind of films?
Actually, in 1971, my first film was not about Bihar. Bihar movement started in 1974. 71, I was a student in America at the time on a scholarship. And that's when there were East Pakistani refugees had come to India because of the oppression by West Pakistan there. And then the country finally became Bangladesh. But before that process had happened, there were all these millions of refugees, and we were trying to raise money at my university in Boston. And we organized a fast, asked people not to eat for a day, and give that money to the people, send it across. And then I filmed. I had borrowed equipment from the theater department, and I made a short film about whether people were fasting or not fasting, and why they were doing it. So it was a kind of a funny film about people making excuses why they had to eat. And I intercut that with the condition of the refugees. So that was my first foray into filmmaking.
But it sounds amusing, but also it sounds like you were an activist first and a filmmaker later. Is that correct?
Yeah, and then in the same period, I also filmed anti-Vietnam War protests, because that was part of the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, and that footage never got made into a film, but at least I sort of got my taste of shooting and doing camera work. Then I didn't do anything with that for many years. I came back to India, worked in a village for a few years doing social work, and then went to the Bihar movement because the pace of change was very slow, and Bihar movement sounded very exciting. So I joined them, and they asked me to take photographs because they expected police violence on a particular day when there was a big demonstration. And I borrowed a Super 8 camera and a friend who had another camera. So we went and filmed that day's demonstration. And then this footage it is like a really amateur cameras, and the film would get spoiled every time you projected it, because it used to be, it was what is called reversal stock. There was no negative. You actually projected what you'd originally shot. So then we projected it on a screen and refilmed it with a 16mm camera to blow it up. And so it's a very sort of low cost and technically terrible film, but it became my sort of first film, which was called Waves of Revolution, which is about the movement which led to the state of emergency being declared in India in 1975 by Indira Gandhi. Over a period of time, I became a filmmaker, but it was originally through activism that I got there.
So your activism comes first and your filmmaking sort of came second. Was it a sort of love at first sight with filmmaking? I mean, you described these early experiences, shooting something around the Vietnam War, this experience in Bihar, working with Super 8 cameras, which I can still remember, not the easiest things to work with as well. So, was it, the second you picked up a camera, you sort of fell in love, or was it a slower process in thinking about how it can serve the activism?
No, actually, I don't think I ever fell in love with filmmaking per se. It was always an instrument to tell the story that I wanted to tell. And it was in a country like India, especially where there's so much illiteracy. It was better than, writing articles and, trying to, get your thoughts across on a bigger scale. You could do that through cinema much faster. So documentary films were the way of communications for me.
Yeah, and I think the work that we're doing here at Peace Vigil is also, and that shooting and Nishant Nachiman have done around street theater and so on, is using the same principle that we can't reach everyone through the written word. We have to use other tools.
Yeah, music. I know Nishant from years ago, when Shireen was the baby and used to go sing with her parents.
Yeah, and we're still doing it. So our YouTube channel is trying to do similar things. Fast forwarding a few years, in the past couple of movies, you focused a little bit more on Dalit issues and on communal issues. And just looking, to prepare for this interview, I sort of rewatched some of your older films. I mean, I'm just thinking about how much work must have gone into films like Ram Ke Naam or Reason. Of course, these films have also been censored, and we'll talk about the kind of censorship that you've had to deal with. But before we get into that,
let me correct you there.
Sure.
They have attempted to be. I mean, there was attempts at censorship. They never succeeded, because I fought I've fought against censorship right from the beginning. They've always tried to cut something here or there, but I've always fought it out legally through the censor board mechanisms, and then going to court when necessary. And I actually won all my court cases. And we even not only won the right to show the films with a censor certificate, but we forced our national television broadcaster, Doordarshan, to telecast these films, because they always said no, but we went to court and said that these films are made in the public interest, and you're denying my freedom of expression by not showing it on a public channel. And the courts ruled in my favor, and we won 7 court cases to show various different films.
Yeah, fascinating. And I'm anxious to learn if that's changed with the changing nature of the courts.
Completely changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's get to that in a second, if you don't mind, because I actually want to talk about the filmmaking process. So, looking at a film like Ram Ke Naam, I imagine it would be quite difficult to get people on record on sort of both sides of that story. So you have some people who would be afraid to go on record because their lives may be in jeopardy. And in fact, one of the key interviews at the end of that film, you find out that he was killed a year after that film came out. And for other people, they're basically admitting to hate crimes on camera. And it must be difficult to get them to do that as well. So are these some of the difficulties you face in getting these interviews and getting people to go on record?
Actually, it's very surprising, but the people who do the hating are not the least bit embarrassed by their own hatred. They're not even conscious that that is what they're doing, and so they're happy to air their views most of the time. Now it's a bit more difficult for me personally, because I get recognized, but especially in the old days, I didn't get recognized, and people were happy that there was some camera to speak into and air their views. So you have all these bigots who say anything that comes into their head, or just reveal who they are. And as far as the people who, the protagonists, I mean, the people who are on the side of reason and on the side of progress, it is more dangerous for them. And even the incident that you described, where the Pujari Laldas, the priest of the Ram temple at the time, spoke, who was a very secular human being, and whose idea of Hinduism was very inclusive. And he said that these people, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad and the RSS and the people who are coming to to demolish this mosque, don't realize that if they believe in God, God is already here. God is we're in a place where we're already worshipping Ram. So what's the reason of breaking this place down? And he said openly that this was being done only for money and for political power. It had nothing to do with religion. The Vishwa Hindu Parishad had not come to pray there even once. So they were just using it.
Yeah. Following up on that case, do you know if his murderers were ever tried or sentenced or anything like that?
Even when he died, it was a small item in the newspapers. It was, on the 27th page in a small little column. It said controversial priest killed. They didn't point out what the controversy was. The controversy was that this was a person who believed in an inclusive idea of Hinduism, and that's why he was murdered. And I was just getting to that story because when I made the film, I knew immediately that this was going to create trouble for him because he was so outspoken. So the very first screening that we did was in Lucknow, and he came for that screening, and he loved the film, and he took away. In those days, we distributed these films on VHS tapes. So he took 6 or 7 tapes back to show, and I said that you realize that you're going to become a bigger target now because you're saying this on camera. And he laughed and he said, I wouldn't have said all that if I didn't believe in it, and if I didn't want it to be. I'm happy that that this message is going to go far and wide. So he was a very brave human being who basically put his life on the line.
So the cut that I've seen, which describes his death a year after the film came out, that was a re-edit that you guys did later, is it?
Yeah, because I had finished the film in 91. That's when I went and showed it in Lucknow when he saw it. And then after he was murdered, we added an epilogue. And 2 things happened after that. One was at the time that I first started showing the film, the Babri Masjid hadn't been demolished. It had been attacked in 1990, and that's what the film describes. But in 1992, December, they actually demolished the mosque. And after the BJP then won elections in UP. And when they won elections, they removed Pujari Laldas from the priesthood of the temple, and they removed his bodyguards. And that's when the killing took place. So I added this little epilogue at the end.
Wow. So just I mean, for listeners who may not understand the full scope of what you're saying, this was a court-appointed sort of religious caretaker of the space of Ram Janmabhoomi, who was the government changed and he lost his security protection and was then killed. Right. My goodness.
That's right.
Okay. This is
and it never made the news in any big way. It never. It was a tiny item in the newspapers, and that is the tragedy of all the secular heroes of our countries. The people who have put their lives on the line, and nobody remembers them because the history doesn't record their stories, and certainly they're not taught in school and colleges where they should be. If we want to create secular democracy, these are the people we would be talking about. I'll tell you another story related to the Babri Masjid issue. You know that recently the Supreme Court granted, basically the Supreme Court rewarded those who did the demolition, because the Supreme Court, said that the land belonged to baby Ram. Like the Supreme Court recognized the legal authority of a god on
This is
earth.
the Ram Lalla being the sort of plaintiff or something.
Yeah, he appointed his lawyer and he won the court case. And so one is that they gave this property to the wrongful people when the property belonged to the Waqf board. And then they said nobody demolished the mosque, in the sense like nobody killed Jessica. It's that kind of a story where it's because they know that the mosque was demolished. They said, yes, the mosque was demolished, but it was demolished by hooligans who are unidentified. Now, it so happens that the people who started Tehelka, if you remember Tehelka, Anirudh Bahal also later started Cobra Post. And in Cobra Post, they did a sting operation with hidden cameras. And they interviewed a lot of the people who were accused of doing the Babri Masjid demolition. And a lot of people on camera confessed to what they had done. So the court knew exactly who these people were. They had self-confessed on camera. And yet they said, we don't know who these people are. In that same Supreme Court judgment, they traced the origin of the fight between Hindus and Muslims to, guess which year? 1857. 1857, they say, was when the British made a demarcation wall in the Babri Masjid where, Hindus and Muslims. So it's the first time that the court records this dispute. Now, that same Supreme Court doesn't mention the fact that 1857 was the War of Independence, the first War of Independence where Hindus and Muslims united against the British, and they fought, but they almost defeated the British. It was actually through a few traitors who sided with the British that the British finally won.
100%. And we have on our channel, we have several documents, several interviews with historians who've documented what happened in 1857. Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, Shireen's father has done a wonderful book on 1857, looking at the stories of the spies. The only records there are the British and their own spies. So these letters tell you the whole picture. But anyway, in that 1857 incident in Ayodhya, there was a Hindu priest, Ramcharan Das, and there was a Muslim landlord, Achan Mia, and they actually united, and they said, we'll make a settlement between this bit in the Babri Masjid, so Hindus can pray in one part of the temple, and what they call one part, and the Muslims could pray in the other part. So this compromise lasted for almost 100 years, till 1949, when some Hindu priests from the not Bajrang Dal, it was, I forget all these, basically RSS people, installed these Ram idols inside the mosque in the middle of the night. Now, what happened to this Hindu priest and the Muslim leader of that time in 1857, at the end of what the British call the mutiny, and we call the First War of Independence, these two people were hung by the British as an example, because they had created unity between Hindus and Muslims. The British made them the example of the bad guys, and they were killed. Now, these again are like Pujari Laldas. These are our secular heroes who have been forgotten by history. And that is the story of of both India and Pakistan, that we have written out of existence the stories of the wonderful people who fought for communal harmony.
Too true, too true. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, which is that we never recognize the voice of reason sufficiently. And I think it's that thought that probably led you to make this latest film, Reason or Vivek. And it's, for me, I'm involved in these movements. I've been involved in these movements for years and years. But even for me, it was very powerful to see these people who are no longer with us speaking with such clarity and such conviction, and such, reason is a very good word for it. They're just really clearly making points. And it strikes me that movie is doing what, unfortunately, our mainstream media is not doing, which is to say that, look, this is the important points, right? You're talking about, you give someone page 27 in an obituary or whatever, and you're missing that what they stood for was this powerful voice of reason and of the Constitution. And these are the forces that killed them. Am I describing the film
Yeah.
correctly?
Yeah, in the case of Ram Ke Naam, it's not even that he was a typical rationalist in the sense of a scientific rationalist, but he was I would call him a liberation theologist. I mean, he was a priest, but he believed in inclusive religion, where there was no enemy between him and. He said Ram is everywhere. Ram would be in a Muslim, so it's not, you don't have to separate.
Yeah, yeah. Fantastic stuff. And no, and I really do appreciate that these films are being made and that you're continuing to make these films. I think it's amazing. And we'll put links to places where people can purchase your films down below. As we mentioned, nearly all your films, the Indian government or the censor board has tried to censor most of, or nearly all of your films. In fact, maybe all of your films. But most of that happened. In fact, nearly all of it happened before the current dispensation was in power. So when thinking about films on caste or on repression, made in the 80s, why would one would assume that the Congress or parties loyal to the Congress party were on the censor board, right? That's the assumption. Why would those parties be interested in censoring your films?
Well, yeah, that's the irony. Had the Congress done its job, had it been a genuinely secular party, they would have celebrated the secular heroes of our country. They wouldn't have taken a back seat. They would have welcomed a film like Ram Ke Naam or many of the films that I've made and other people have made, and they would have shown them themselves on Doordarshan. Instead, what did they do? They showed for 2 years running the Ramayan serial, which preceded the demolition of the Babri Masjid. So you can see what is happening. For 2 years, there was a cultural assault. I'm not saying the Ramayana is a bad story. I mean, it's one of our epics. It's part of our culture, and everybody should know it. But it was through that Ramayan's TV serial that this story reached every nook and corner of the country. It was the most popular thing. People would sit up, on Sundays and watch it, drop everything else and watch the serial. So that prepared the ground for this assault on the Babri Masjid. And this is a story all through. Where the government is in control, the so-called secular governments, they have allowed the most obscure forces to take over culture, and they have actually blocked the entry of the secular voice. Occasionally, one or two things would get into on TV, like like the history of India and that sort of thing would come occasionally, but TV would be full of completely obscurantist and superstitious stuff, whether it was Jai Santoshi Ma or anything. In our country, gods and religions can be created overnight, and they're very often commercial creations. They're not religious creations to start with. They become religious later, but they're actually done for money very often.
As you're saying this, a couple of things are coming to mind. I mean, the first is just to remind our younger viewers that there was a time when Indian TV meant Doordarshan. There was nothing else, right?
Yeah, there was no other channel.
Right. The second thing to say is that this was happening at a time, the 1980s and so on, when privatization was coming in, when neoliberal reforms were coming in, when this there was a campaign partly by the World Bank, but partly by Indian elites to sort of talk about the Hindu rate of growth and how whatever vestiges of sort of Nehruvian socialism may have existed had to be destroyed. And I'm wondering if there's any connection between that story, the sort of birth of neoliberalism story.
I mean, these are all interlinked stories. I mean, for instance, the color TV and all this came to India with the Asian Games, which is the 1980s. Asian Games is the beginning of the liberalization era. So between the 1980s and 1990s is when liberalization came in a big way. And you would think that if money is God, they wouldn't worry about all the different gods that existed. But actually, there was no contradiction between the capitalist God and the religious gods. In fact, they helped each other. So what took a backseat was the idea of socialism, the idea that people who were the most deprived in our country, the people who were mistreated because of caste or class, should have a bigger share of the pie. All that was done away with when the idea of free market came, and then you had rise of lots of different sort of religious divisions, and this didn't happen just in India. It happened all across the world. I mean, look at the collapse of Yugoslavia, where under Tito, you never heard of clashes between Muslims and Christians and all of that, but that deteriorated when Yugoslavia fell apart, and you had the massacre in Bosnia. You had all of these massacres that happened with the arrival with the collapse of the idea of something larger than religion that would be the
Yeah.
unifying factor.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Eastern Europe, it was, one wonders if it was religious violence in the sense of what we see in India as sort of religious violence to some extent, or was it opportunists using religion sort of to sort of make their own fiefdoms, right?
Always, that's what I'm saying. Even in the Indian case, it's not the religious. In fact, I have nothing against people who are religious. I have nothing against people who go to pray in the temple or go to pray in the mosque or anywhere, but it's a private affair. It should be their own privilege to have their own set of beliefs and not foist it on others, and at least not foist it on others in a violent way.
Yeah. No, I agree. I guess what I'm saying is there are ideologues. So you can think of like your Wahhabi mullah or whatever. Let's use a non-Indian case, right? And then there are gangsters. There are people who use the Wahhabism to sort of increase their political territory, right?
And then behind them are forces that are beneficiaries. So it's not by accident that you suddenly see Islamic jihad in the world. Islamic jihad probably died out with the Crusades. The idea of Islamic jihad. I mean, when for centuries we don't hear about it, and when we suddenly start hearing about it in the 20th century, and where does it occur? It happens in places where the superpowers want to control the oil, want to control some kind of natural resource, and they use religion to create havoc in those areas, and then they go in and this is what you see. You saw the democratically elected government of Iran, of Mossadegh, overthrown by British Petroleum and the CIA. You saw the same thing happen to Saddam Hussein, who had nothing to do with the 9/11 attack. They went and attacked Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan had nothing to do with the 9/11 attack. Osama bin Laden was a creation of the Americans. He was his father was in partnership with George Bush Sr. in an oil company. So you have all these interlinkages, and you can see where the idea of this religious extremism is being used by somebody who's a beneficiary. And you saw how the British benefited by doing it to India. When they did partition of India, they didn't give the vote to all Muslims to decide whether they wanted to be in Pakistan or India. They gave it only to the elite Muslims. They gave it only to the landed Muslims, and the people who had property could vote. And they were afraid that this Congress party are full of socialists and they're going to take away our land. And so they preferred to be so when, again, Shamsul Shireen's father has written a book about Muslims against partition, where he talks about Allah Baksh. Allah Baksh was a guy who had united all the huge number of Muslims who were against partition, larger number than those who were for partition. But he was murdered in 1943, probably by the Muslim League, in cahoots with the British. So I'm saying there's behind all this strife is a beneficiary, and we should always look for who is making the money out of this, who is actually benefiting.
100%. And to remind our listeners that there are interviews with Professor Islam, Professor Shamsul Islam on Allah Baksh and that movement on this channel. So just to talk a little bit about the current moment, sort of culturally, there was a time, listen, I haven't been coming to India that, you can probably tell from my accent, I'm born and raised in the West, but I started coming to India in the 1990s. And even then, it was very rare to see mainstream presenters or mainstream politicians who would openly admit to having ties with communalism. I think you've documented in Naam, maybe you've documented some of the exceptions. But now we have figures like Arnab Goswami as kind of the extreme case, who seems to be wanting to take hate mainstream. And I think that that has changed even the elite culture a little bit. Do you think, what's your understanding of how the mainstream culture has changed in these past few years?
It has been changing for a while, and it's not only Arnab Goswami. Unfortunately, there are many mainstream anchors, TV anchors, especially in the non-English, in the Hindi language, who have been very nasty about minorities. As far as the absolute elite is concerned, I think the tide might be beginning to change, in the sense that in fact, today we see a little less support from the elite for these extreme right-wing forces, because I think even they are embarrassed by what is going on. What happened in Haridwar a few weeks ago, if you know that story about how there was open calls for genocide against Muslims, I think has embarrassed a lot of people. And I think that even amongst the elite, you see less of that kind of chatter. I mean, I can tell from how badly I'm being trolled on places like Facebook or Twitter or wherever. And I can see a reduction in the kind of trolling that people like me get right now, because I think people are waking up to the fact that this has gone too far. I don't think that in the long run fascism is sustainable in India. I'm making a big statement here because it looks like we're headed that way. Yeah. But I think that we as Amartya Sen puts it, we are argumentative Indians. We're not going to tolerate one single leader who lays down the rule for everyone to follow. Yeah. And I think there is a backlash that is growing now. Yeah. You can see even in UP, in Uttar Pradesh, where the BJP won huge majority last time, and it's the biggest state in India in terms of the number of seats. But you can see a lot of defections that are happening from the BJP to other parties. So there are signs of hope right now. And you saw what happened to the farmers' movement. The farmers' movement was a huge victory for the people of India, for the farmers of India, of course, and for farmers everywhere in the world who are being oppressed by agribusiness, who are trying to take away their right to livelihood. Yeah. And the farmers won this major victory. So I think that I'm feeling a little optimistic right now.
Great. So allow me to interject a little bit of cynicism into that optimism, in the sense that some people are saying that the reason that the farmers were successful, to the extent they were successful, there's another question about all of their demands haven't been met, etc. But some of them have. But to the extent they've been successful, some people are saying no, it's just because the BJP is playing politics and there may be elections coming up in Punjab and they want to win votes, and etc.
Yeah, but that's a sign of democracy. If they're responding to the fact that elections are coming up and they've got to change their story, that is an example of the democratic process at work.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Just to go back to something a little bit earlier, when we're talking about the Congress Party as it exists now, so the Congress Party as it existed in the 80s and 90s, when it was sort of, it wasn't stopping the censorship of your films, let's put it that way, the attempted censorship of your films. One would say that it was infiltrated by soft Hindutva, right? This is the terms that we used to use on the left, right? Is that still the case? Is Congress Party still a place where soft Hindutva can exist?
It's a difficult situation for the Congress Party. let's be realistic uh, about what's going on right now. So realistically, every time Rahul Gandhi or someone, and Rahul Gandhi is one of the people who has spoken out very openly, consistently against these kind of, both against the corruption that is going on by the BJP, as well as against the attacks on the minorities. Uh, it's a very difficult position because here is the irony. The BJP always said that the Congress party, by appealing to Muslims, is doing vote bank politics. But if you think about it, Muslims are 13 or 14% of the population. So if somebody wanted to do vote bank politics, why would they concentrate on the 14% and not on the 80%? So the BJP is concentrating their hate politics appealing to the 80%, and the Congress is stuck talking to the 14%. They cannot make a lot of headway that way. And so they feel that they have to somehow reach out to the middle ground of Hindus. Uh, and sometimes they do it very badly, they do it stupidly. But I appreciate the work of people. There's a group in America that started recently called Hindus for Human Rights. And I think that's good because they are Hindus who are saying, not in my name. You saying to the BJP and the RSS, not in my name. You cannot do these massacres. You cannot spread this hatred in the name of Hinduism. That's not who we are. That is Hindutva. And they make a distinction between Hindutva, which was a term coined by Savarkar, who was the mastermind behind the murder of Mahatma Gandhi. And Savarkar coined this term Hindutva, which is basically he was an open fascist. He was an admirer of Hitler, as was the RSS. And so you have Hindus who are saying, no, this is not who we are. We are an inclusive religion. They go back to another definition of what Hinduism means.
100%. And we have worked, with Hindus for Human Rights, and I think we saw you on a panel and an event with them some time ago as well. I wanted to go back to something else that you've said. So thinking about the work around Bhim Comrade, and I see a picture of Ambedkar right behind you. You said a little while ago that you don't think that fascism can stay in Indian soil. I'm paraphrasing what you said, yeah? But when I think about what Dr. Ambedkar may say to that is that he may say something to the effect of, well, fascism has been here for hundreds of years, if not longer. What's your thinking along those lines?
No, well, I mean, this is semantics maybe, but I don't think he would use the word fascism, but casteism, of course, has been there for thousands of years, and it is the worst form of exploitation known to human beings. The idea that a people are designated as having to do the dirty work, being dirty, being untouchables, and this stigma has existed for thousands of years and still exists today. And today, as the underclass becomes politically conscious and starts raising its voice, the atrocities against them have increased because some people think that now we are seeing more atrocities than before. That's because before people were not fighting back as much as they are now. And now that the fight back has started, the atrocities have increased. And so, yes, you're right that we cannot even call ourselves a democracy if we don't give equal rights to all the citizens of India. And the caste system doesn't allow the system to give equal rights, even though legally that ended with independence because the constitution deemed everybody to be equal. But it takes a much longer time for society to adopt those values. And so that is an ongoing fight.
Yeah, an ongoing fight and a very important fight. Thank you, Anandji, for being so generous with your time. I wanted to sort of ask something as I take us towards the close of this discussion. There are many people who are watching this interview who have been inspired by your life, by your work, and who are doing similar things. I mean, we really try and work with artists who are working to bring about peace and harmony along class lines, caste lines, racial lines, and so on. But sometimes when we do this work, we feel that we're just, preaching to the converted or singing to the choir or whatever sort of phrase you want to say. So especially the kind of art that you're making, the kind of sort of, it really doesn't pull its punches, does it? These films. Can that change people's minds, and is it worth doing even if it doesn't change people's minds? What are your thoughts on this?
No, I think there are two things about that. And even I'm not even against preaching to the converted, because many times the people who are ideologically sympathetic with us do not have all the facts at hand, do not have a coherent argument. So when they are faced up against somebody who doesn't agree with them, they can't make a coherent argument. And so I think that if they watch these films, not just my films, but films like this, literature like this, it gives them an argument that they can make. They can be more persuasive if they have those facts to muster. That's one issue. The other thing is that, at least I've found with my own films, is that they do communicate across a wide spectrum. It's not that they're aimed at the elite. They're actually aimed at everybody. And people, because I make Hindi language versions of my films. There's a Tamil version, there's a Malayalam version. So people are actually watching them in different languages and across class and caste lines. And there is a conversation. And there are people, I get lots of messages from people, say after Ram Ke Naam was made till now, I've got literally scores of people who were car sevaks, people who actually went to demolish the mosque, who watched the film and said that we feel ashamed of what we had done. We understand now that we were misled. And so I think that the potential exists very much for change to happen by watching a film, by reading a book, if we didn't believe that, we wouldn't exist. I mean, why would we speak? Because nothing is going to change. But I believe that the communication does happen, and that is exactly why these films they keep trying to censor them. They keep trying to suppress them. They don't want, and they're dictate. In the old days, they used to send their right-wing hordes to my screenings. To attack the screenings, to participate in the discussion and boo me down, or to shout against the film. But they realized that some of their own people who went to those screenings came back with a lot of questions, and so they now don't allow their people to go to these screenings at all. They're happy to abuse me on whatever channel, but not allow the film to be seen and then do the discussion. Do it just to prevent the screening.
Fascinating stuff. It reminds me, many years ago, there was a lecture by Romila Thapar that got, I'm talking about in Maryland, in the United States, where these khaki knickerwallas, they showed up, yeah? And of course, they couldn't have a meaningful debate either with her or with her supporters. So they just sort of, it was a strange scene. And we may have converted people, I don't know. The conversion is a sort of a longer term thing. The confrontation happens right away.
It's not even conversion. You just plant an idea, and it might take years to germinate, because it's not one single input that's going to change somebody's mind. But you open a door, and then some other inputs also happen in life to them, and then they suddenly realize that they were on the wrong path. And that's 100%. Happened to many people.
Yeah, 100%.
You have books written by people who have left the RSS. You have many people who have left and have written their stories. Like you have CIA officers who told the story of what they did when they were in the CIA.
Very true. My last question, Anandji, is this. So, I've lived most of my life sort of outside of India, and we, on our channel, we have a lot of people who are following from the US, from Australia, here in South Africa as well. What can people who are not, the impression that we have from outside is that, as you say, these fascist forces have taken over, and there's a need for solidarity, but sometimes we don't know how to give our solidarity, how to express our solidarity. So what can we tell people in the diaspora about how they can support your work and the work of others like you?
So I think that I would say to the diaspora that they should organize within their countries of where they've chosen to live, like the Hindus for Human Rights in America are doing that, and I think there's no reason why that can't happen in South Africa. There's a huge Indian population, and there should be a secular movement of secular South Asians in South Africa, people who are of Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi origin or Sri Lankan. Yeah. So because we all have been oppressed by the same imperialist forces, and the same mindset was instilled into us by those people, and we are still victims of that. So I think that is the attempt that I would focus on, rather than, a little bit of donation that might come in from here or there. That's not going to change very much, but you can organize in your own area, and I think that's the most fruitful thing to do. I don't think you should be discouraged by the fact that the diaspora is not on your side at the moment, because that is a process, that is a moment in time which will not last.
Yeah. So I'll tell you, when Gujarat happened in 2000, was it 2002? It was, yeah? Yeah, Shidi and I went, so Shidi wrote a play, very powerful play, where basically it starts with the RSS people organizing something, and then one of their children ends up where the danga is actually happening in Ahmedabad. And then he tries to save his own child, and the child eventually gets saved by a Muslim character, right? So It was a very powerful play, but the problem, and we performed it, but we were invited to perform it in a place called, by a group, in a temple, by a group called the Vishva Hindi Parishad. Now we got very, very concerned. We're like, oh God, what are we going to do? So she took that place. Her background, she grew up in these places, and she made it even more powerful, even more sort of stimulating. And in the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. And people with Gujarati Brahmin names were coming up afterwards and say, "Beta apne 1947 ki yaad itna dil aaye aur ye sab hua," and then telling us stories about who came over, etc., etc. So I do think that there is a way to access through emotion and through drama and all these things.
Yeah, because what is at the root of the hatred? Basically, the root of the hatred is fear. It's the fear of the other. And what amazes me is that this 80% strong majority is so deathly afraid of the 14% small minority. And that is the fear psychosis that's been instilled through brainwashing. And so it won't take a lot if you break through that fear psychosis. And once the fear goes, the hate will go.
100%. Anand Patwardhan, it's been a real pleasure. I hope we can do this again sometime.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a Peace Vigil conversation with award-winning documentary filmmaker Anand Patwardhan. Samir Dosani was the interviewer. The music is by Jeremy Karodia and Shireen, and the artwork is by Lal Bahadur. Peace Vigil is a peace education organization. We make tools that help you dismantle prejudice and hatred. Do remember to like and subscribe wherever you're listening, and remember, peace needs all of us.